Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be picking up with Plato's Republic,
Okay.
where we left off. We're moving into Book 4,
Sounds good.
and we're going to take a closer look at the guardians in Plato's ideal city.
All right.
So we're going to explore their way of life
Okay.
and examine the important duties they're entrusted with. And right away, we encounter a fascinating challenge to Socrates' vision.
Yeah, Adimantus, one of the participants in the dialogue, raises a pretty pointed objection. He says that the guardians, as Socrates has described them, don't really seem to be very happy.
He makes a good point.
Yeah.
Adimantus points out that they're denied personal wealth, they can't travel freely, and they miss out on all the luxuries enjoyed by others in the city. He even compares them to hired bodyguards,
Yeah.
working for little more than just their basic needs.
It's a striking comparison, isn't it? He's trying to highlight this contrast between the simple, almost austere lives of the guardians and the potentially lavish lifestyles of the other citizens.
But Socrates, he's not really fazed by this challenge.
No, he's not.
He responds with a clever analogy,
Yes.
comparing the city to a statue
Okay.
being painted. He argues that you wouldn't make the eyes of the statue so beautiful that they no longer function as eyes. Similarly, you shouldn't give the guardians a lifestyle that would make them ineffective
Right.
at their primary role, which is safeguarding the city.
That's a good point. What's interesting here is that he isn't dismissing happiness altogether. He's just shifting the focus from individual happiness to the happiness of the entire city.
The whole.
Yeah, and suggesting that true happiness for the individual and the community comes from each part fulfilling its proper function, even if that means some individual desires have to be curtailed.
It's a thought-provoking idea, isn't it? How much individual freedom should be sacrificed for the well-being of society as a whole?
Yeah.
This is a question that I think continues to resonate even today as we grapple with these issues of social responsibility, personal liberty, and the role of government.
Yeah.
And Socrates goes on to argue that both extreme wealth and extreme poverty can be detrimental to the city.
Yes.
He suggests that too much wealth can lead to laziness,
Right.
indulgence,
Yeah.
and a decline in civic virtue, while too much poverty can breed resentment,
Of course.
crime,
Yeah,
and social unrest.
definitely.
So to illustrate this point, he talks about a potter who becomes wealthy
Okay.
and begins to neglect his craft.
All right.
Instead of focusing on producing quality work, he becomes preoccupied with luxury and status
Right.
and leisure. And Socrates suggests that this kind of shift in priorities can undermine the very foundations
Yes.
of a well-ordered society.
It's a really insightful example, I think, because it speaks to this deeper concern that runs throughout the entire republic, which is this potential for corruption and decay, even within what seems like a well-structured system. So he's warning us that even if we establish a just and harmonious society,
Right.
it won't necessarily stay that way
Right.
unless we're actively guarding against the corrupting influences of wealth
Yeah.
and power and unchecked desires.
It's fascinating to consider how this might apply to our modern world, because we certainly see examples of wealth leading to excess
Yeah,
and a decline in civic engagement.
for sure.
And we also see the devastating effects of poverty
Right.
and inequality. Socrates' warning about the dangers of these extremes, I think, feels as relevant today as it was in ancient Greece.
Absolutely. I agree.
Yeah,
For sure.
totally. It's
Yeah.
a powerful message. And it leads us into Socrates' vision for these guardians. He envisions them as this unique class of citizen, distinct from both the wealthy elite and the working class.
So it's almost like he's proposing a new type of aristocracy,
Yeah.
but one based not on birth or wealth,
Right.
but on character and merit. Exactly. And to ensure their effectiveness, he outlines a very specific way of life for them.
Yes, he describes them as this like warrior athlete,
Right.
ideal,
Right.
highly disciplined, rigorously trained,
Yep.
focused on physical and mental excellence.
Uh-huh. He even uses this memorable image of lean, fit dogs taking down fat, tender sheep, which really highlights the contrast he's envisioning between the guardian's strength and the potential softness of those who are indulging in luxury.
Yeah, it's a very vivid image.
Yeah.
And it speaks to Socrates' belief that the guardians have to be capable of defending the city from both external threats and internal corruption.
Exactly.
But it's not all about, physical strength.
No.
Socrates emphasizes that their most important task is actually preserving the education system.
That's right.
He sees education as absolutely crucial.
Oh, yeah. This is where we see Plato's deep commitment to the power of education. He believes that a well-designed education system can instill those values
Right.
and knowledge necessary for a just and harmonious society.
And the guardians, as the wisest and most virtuous citizens,
Right.
are entrusted with safeguarding the system from harmful changes.
Makes me think about how much emphasis we place on education today. And
Yeah.
while our systems are obviously vastly different
Totally.
than what Plato envisioned,
Yeah,
we still recognize education as this like vital component
of
of a
course.
functioning society.
Yeah, for sure.
Socrates even argues that if the education system is working properly, citizens will naturally develop their own just laws
Right.
and regulations.
Yeah.
So it eliminates the need for this constant legislative tinkering.
He contrasts this with what he calls the ill city,
Right.
which is constantly trying to patch things up with new laws, but never actually addressing the root cause of the problem.
That's an interesting distinction. It seems like he's suggesting that true social harmony comes not from imposing rules from above, but from cultivating virtue and wisdom within the citizens themselves.
Yeah.
Precisely. And this brings us to another fascinating aspect of Plato's vision for the guardians, which is their relationship to culture.
Yes, Socrates and Adeimantus have this really interesting conversation about the power of music.
Right.
Of all things,
Yeah.
they agree that seemingly harmless changes in musical styles can actually lead to, like, wider social upheaval.
Yeah.
This seemed a bit extreme to me at first.
Yeah, it might seem that way on the surface, but if you consider the broader context, what Plato's really highlighting is this profound influence of culture on our values and beliefs. He's suggesting that even subtle shifts
Great.
in what we consider entertaining or acceptable can have these ripple effects throughout society.
That's an interesting way to look at it. It makes me think about how cultural trends
Right.
and artistic expressions can reflect deeper societal values.
Yeah.
How shifts in those expressions might signal changes in those underlying values.
Exactly. And for Plato, this connection between culture and values was crucial. He believed that the guardians needed to be vigilant about protecting those cultural traditions that supported a virtuous society.
Right.
They needed to be aware of how even seemingly minor changes in music or art or literature could over time erode the foundations of justice and wisdom.
So we've talked about protecting the education system and preserving these cultural traditions, but what exactly are they protecting the city from?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of Plato's concerns about what could undermine even the most carefully constructed society. Remember earlier we were talking about the dangers of wealth and poverty?
Yeah.
Those themes come back in full force here.
Socrates argues that, like, the accumulation of wealth can lead to luxury, idleness, and ultimately revolution. It's as if a city, when it becomes too focused on wealth and material possessions, loses its vitality and becomes vulnerable to both internal and external threats.
Precisely. And on the flip side, widespread poverty can lead to resentment, crime, and a level of desperation that can also destabilize the city. So it's not just about protecting against one extreme or the other, but about maintaining some kind of balance.
It seems like Socrates is advocating for this society where people have what they need, but they're not consumed by the pursuit of excessive wealth
Yeah.
or weighed down by the burdens of poverty.
That's a great way to put it. And this concern about balance extends beyond just material wealth.
Okay.
Socrates also talks about the importance of guarding against what he calls the mob,
Okay.
those who appeal to the lowest common denominator, who stir up emotions and prejudices for their own gain.
That sounds very familiar.
Doesn't it?
It makes me think about how political rhetoric can sometimes be used to divide people,
Right.
pit one group against another, all for the sake of political power.
Yes. It's a timeless problem, isn't it? This manipulation of fear and anger and resentment for political gain. And Socrates suggests that one of the best ways to guard against this kind of manipulation is through education.
It seems that education is a recurring theme here in the Republic. Socrates sees it as like a solution to so many of the challenges facing society.
Absolutely. Socrates believed that if citizens are properly educated, they'd be able to see through empty promises and discern truth from falsehood. They would be equipped to make wise decisions, both for themselves and for the community.
But there's another kind of more subtle threat that Socrates highlights, and that is this gradual erosion of values and traditions. I thought this part of the dialogue was really fascinating, especially the conversation about music.
Right.
Socrates argues that these seemingly harmless changes in musical styles can eventually lead to a weakening of moral fiber,
Ah,
this loosening of standards that can undermine the entire social order.
that might seem like a stretch to a modern audience. But it makes sense when you consider the powerful influence that music and art and literature have on our values and beliefs.
It's like these forms of cultural expression reflect the underlying values of a society.
Yeah.
And if those expressions start to change in ways that are inconsistent with those values, it can create a sense of dissonance, like a feeling that something's out of alignment.
Exactly. And that's why Socrates argues that the guardians need to be particularly attentive to the cultural environment. They need to be aware of how these subtle shifts in music, art, literature might over time erode the foundations of a just and virtuous society.
So it's not just about protecting the city from like external enemies or internal strife,
Right.
but also about safeguarding its cultural integrity,
Yeah.
ensuring that the values and traditions that support a good life are preserved and passed on to future generations.
That's right. And this leads us to a broader understanding of what it means to be a guardian in Plato's ideal city. It's not simply about military strength or political authority. It's about a deep commitment to wisdom, justice, and the well-being of the entire community.
It's a very challenging role, one that demands constant vigilance and a really profound understanding of human nature. As we wrap up our deep dive into Book 4 of the Republic, it's just fascinating to reflect on how Plato's ideas continue to resonate even today. We may not agree with all of his proposals, but his insights into the challenges of building a just and harmonious society, they're remarkably relevant.
They are.
He reminds us that the pursuit of a good life, both for ourselves and for our communities, requires careful thought and thoughtful action, and a willingness to engage in these meaningful dialogues about the values that shape our world.
And perhaps most importantly, he inspires us to never stop questioning,
Right.
to never stop striving for that elusive ideal of a truly just and virtuous society.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes, thank you.
We'll be back soon to explore more fascinating ideas and continue our journey into this world of knowledge and insight. Until then, keep those minds engaged and keep those questions coming.